Let me be very clear. What happened in the last few hours is unprecedented. Iran has just unleashed more than 200 Sejjil missiles directly on Israel, and the much vaunted Israeli defenses have collapsed under the weight of that barrage. This is not theory. This is the new reality on the ground right now, unfolding in real time as we speak, with reports confirming coordinated salvos launched from mobile transporter erector launchers scattered across multiple sites deep within Iranian territory. Each wave timed with precision to exploit the vulnerabilities that years of strategic planning had anticipated in the ongoing 2026 U.S.-Israel war with Iran that erupted back in February, when initial strikes on nuclear and proxy facilities set this entire cycle in motion. The Sejjil 2, with its solid fuel propulsion system allowing for launch readiness in under 15 minutes, a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers, and a payload capacity between 700 and 1,500 kilograms per missile, has demonstrated once again its terminal phase maneuvering capabilities, those so-called dancing warheads that twist and evade radar-guided interceptors in ways that fundamentally challenge the assumptions baked into multi-layered defense architectures. Stay with me on this because the scale here demands careful unpacking. This barrage dwarfs even the October 2024 episode in both volume and sophistication, representing a full saturation attack deliberately engineered to exhaust interceptor stocks rather than merely probe defenses, with early indicators already showing at least 40 to 60 missiles either penetrating or achieving near misses on critical infrastructure such as Nevatim Airbase and associated intelligence nodes. Having been inside the system, I can tell you that this kind of operation was exactly what the war planners in Tel Aviv and Washington refused to game out properly, choosing instead to cling to notions of preemptive air superiority and technological edge that have now been exposed as fragile in the extreme. These were not random launches born of desperation, but a calculated, long-planned Iranian response to repeated Israeli and American provocations that had escalated tensions beyond any previous threshold. And as the dust begins to settle on the initial impacts, what we are witnessing is not just tactical success, but a profound shift that teases at deeper strategic failures. Failures that promise to reshape the regional balance in ways that will prove permanent, altering alliances, deterrence equations, and the very calculus of power projection from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. This next part changes everything. Because to understand why this barrage succeeded where previous exchanges faltered, we must place it squarely within the exact timeline of the 2026 conflict. A conflict that began with Israel's strikes on Iranian nuclear and proxy sites in February, followed swiftly by the Trump administration's escalation and provision of logistical support that Tehran had warned against time and again through back channels and public statements alike. Stay with me, because the context here is everything. And having watched these games played from inside the Situation Room across multiple administrations, I can assure you that Iran's demonstration of strategic dominance through patience, meticulous preparation, and the achievement of technological parity has laid bare fundamental miscalculations by both Israel and the United States. Miscalculations rooted in the persistent illusion that sanctions, covert operations, and regime change fantasies could somehow contain a nation that had spent decades honing an asymmetric doctrine of forward defense. Iran's missile inventory, now estimated at over 3,000 ballistic systems, with the Sejjil forming the reliable, survivable backbone, thanks to its shift away from vulnerable liquid fuel preparations, represents the culmination of years of development that the West largely dismissed while focusing on air and naval assets that could never fully neutralize mobile launchers hidden across vast territories. But if you think that's the full story, it's not, because Iran's approach was never impulsive or reactive in the crude sense. It was the patient evolution of a strategy that prioritized survivability en masse over precision in the opening salvos, allowing Tehran to absorb initial blows from February onward and calibrate this response for maximum effect once the provocations crossed an irreversible line. The math is brutal, and it does not lie. Where Israeli and American planners assumed that superior intelligence and rapid preemption would prevent such a launch, Iran proved through the deployment of these solid fuel systems that rapid salvo capability from dispersed, hardened positions negates those advantages, turning what was meant to be a contained operation into a cascading failure of deterrence. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and this barrage embodies precisely the scenario that intelligence assessments consistently downplayed. The moment when Iran's forward defense doctrine, refined through conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon, manifests not as scattered retaliation, but as a symphony of overwhelming force that exposes the hollowness of narratives centered on qualitative military superiority. The math is brutal, and it does not lie when we turn our attention to the unique attributes that made the Sejjil 2 so devastatingly effective in this operation. Attributes that stem from decades of indigenous engineering that transform what began as a response to sanctions into a cornerstone of strategic resilience. Solid fuel propulsion eliminates the lengthy fueling windows that once rendered liquid propellant systems sitting ducks for preemptive strikes, enabling these mobile launchers to remain concealed until the precise moment of ignition, then loft their payloads on trajectories that compress decision times for defenders to mere minutes. Each missile, accelerating to Mach 9 or beyond in its terminal phase, while executing unpredictable maneuvers via sophisticated re-entry vehicles, creates an impossible targeting dilemma for Israel's layered systems. Iron Dome optimized for short-range rockets, David's Sling for medium threats, and the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 batteries tasked with high-altitude ballistic intercepts. Because when 200 threats arrive in overlapping waves, the radar cues overload, the fire control algorithms strain under the volume, and the finite stock of interceptors depletes at a rate that no resupply chain can match in real time. But if you think that's the full story, it's not, because the real vulnerability was baked into the defense architecture itself. An architecture predicated on the assumption of manageable threat streams rather than the saturation tactics Iran has now perfected. Tactics that force defenders into a zero-sum game, where every successful intercept drains irreplaceable high-cost assets, while the attacker retains the capacity for follow-on salvos at fractions of the expense. The cost asymmetry here is not merely economic, but existential in its implications. An individual Sejjil comes in at roughly $500,000 to $1 million, whereas a single Arrow 3 interceptor runs between 2 and 4 million, David's Sling around 1 million, meaning that even a partial success rate against 200 incoming missiles could compel Israel to expend hundreds of millions in a single night, stocks that cannot be replenished overnight from distant suppliers amid competing global demands. Having been inside the system, I can tell you that intelligence assessments failed to fully internalize Iran's rapid scaling of solid fuel technology after the 2010s, when sanctions paradoxically accelerated domestic innovation by compelling self-reliance in propulsion, guidance, and warhead design. Innovations that echo earlier historical parallels, such as the Soviet Union's development of mobile ICBMs during the Cold War to counter American first strike advantages, only here adapted to the narrower geography and higher tempo of Middle Eastern conflict. What comes next is where things take a serious turn, because this saturation barrage did not merely test defenses, it systematically degraded them through sheer volume, with dozens of missiles confirmed to have struck or disrupted key air defense nodes, radar installations, and command and control hubs, thereby compromising the very systems meant to safeguard Israeli airspace during ongoing operations. The reported impacts extend to damaged runways at bases critical for sustaining air sorties in support of U.S. efforts, loss of continuous radar coverage over significant sectors, and a resultant disruption of air operations that had been integral to the broader coalition's posture since February. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and this is precisely the scenario they always hoped would never materialize. One where U.S. and Israeli over-reliance on offensive strikes left defensive depth perilously thin, exposing the limits of a strategy that prioritized qualitative edges without accounting for the quantitative realities of Iran's missile production lines, which churn out these systems at a pace that defies simple disruption. The political fallout inside Israel is already manifesting in ways that will force hard choices on reserve mobilization, escalation thresholds, and the sustainability of prolonged conflict, as this event shatters the narrative of invulnerable defenses that has underpinned public confidence and policy for years. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's public commitments to ironclad support ring increasingly hollow against the logistical realities. Carrier groups positioned in the region, while formidable for power projection, cannot provide comprehensive ballistic missile defense coverage against massed inland launches from Iran, constrained as they are by distance, competing commitments in other theaters, and the inherent limitations of sea-based interceptors against such high-volume, high-speed threats. Proxy coordination adds another layer of complexity here, with this launch synchronizing seamlessly with heightened actions from Hezbollah in the north and Houthi forces in the south, stretching Israeli resources across multiple fronts in a manner that echoes the multi-domain pressures of earlier asymmetric conflicts, but on a scale that demands a strategic rethink at the highest levels. This next part changes everything, because the true game changer revealed by this barrage is Iran's establishment of an operational missile deterrent at a level that neutralizes Israel's conventional superiority, compelling not just tactical adjustments, but a wholesale strategic reevaluation across Tel Aviv, Washington, and beyond. Let me be very clear once more. What we are witnessing is the collapse not just of a defense system, but of an entire strategic assumption. The assumption that Iran could be contained indefinitely through superior air power and selective strikes without triggering a response capable of imposing unsustainable costs. Iran still retains thousands of missiles in reserve. This 200 missile demonstration was not the full arsenal, but a calibrated signal, one that underscores the credibility of far larger barrages should further provocations occur, including those targeting population centers or sensitive sites like Dimona, thereby injecting a nuclear shadow into every escalation calculus. Having been inside the system, I can assure you that the people who matter are already rethinking every assumption they made, as this single operation has degraded Israel's ability to sustain offensive operations and exposed U.S. bases in the region to similar vulnerabilities, casting a long shadow over any lingering nuclear ambiguity or plans for deeper intervention. Iran's leadership has demonstrated remarkable restraint until this moment, absorbing initial blows and choosing the timing to send an unmistakable message that further escalation will be met with overwhelming, proportionate response. A message that dictates the tempo of the conflict rather than merely reacting to it. The broader implications ripple outward. Potential follow-on strikes that could further strain alliance cohesion, the exposure of logistical choke points that no amount of carrier presence can fully shield, and the decisive tipping of the regional power balance toward Tehran, a shift rooted in the patient accumulation of capabilities that the West's maximum pressure campaigns inadvertently fostered rather than forestalled. Stay with me to the end here, because the strategic outlook is crystal clear, and the new reality is one in which Iran has seized the initiative, demonstrating its capacity to impose costs far beyond what Israel or the United States can sustainably absorb without risking broader conflagration. Likely, calls from within Israel for direct U.S. intervention will be tempered by the stark reality of American resources already stretched across multiple global theaters, where de-escalation may emerge as the only rational path forward, even as the danger of miscalculation looms large in the fog of heightened tensions. The broader U.S. policy failure here is decades in the making. Maximum pressure, military posturing, and a refusal to engage with Iran's legitimate security concerns have produced the precise outcome that advisors claimed was impossible, transforming a containable rivalry into a confrontation where missile dominance now dictates terms. Let me be very clear. The region will never return to the pre-2026 status quo, as Iran's missile dominance is no longer a theoretical threat, but an established fact that must shape all future diplomacy, from nuclear negotiations to proxy management and energy security calculations. Potential for 500 or more additional missiles in follow-on waves, if provoked further, underscores the unsustainable strain on U.S. logistics and Israeli reserves, a strain that historical parallels from Vietnam-era overextension or the Soviet experience in Afghanistan warn against repeating. Having been inside the system, I can tell you that the people who matter are already rethinking every assumption they made about containment and superiority, recognizing that this barrage marks the moment when the balance tips decisively and permanently. If you want the real story, not the sanitized version, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join me in the next update. Because what happens in the coming days will determine the shape of the Middle East for the next decade. This is Lawrence Wilkerson signing off. Stay informed, stay analytical.